Hey folks, trying a little something new, a little experiment here. I am at Fort Richardson State Park. For those who are not real familiar with Texas, it's just outside of the city of Jacksboro, town, city. Yeah, we're about 90 miles north of Fort Worth and about roughly the same distance from the Oklahoma state line. I decided to give a shot at doing a video. This is all part of the master plan. My plan for world domination. Ha ha ha. No, I'm kidding. I am probably going to go YouTube with some of my adventures. And so this was sort of a way to put that together. I'm going to beg your forgiveness for this one. The quality is not top notch. This is not a Hollywood presentation, not a cable TV type deal. As a matter of fact, I did most of the video on a 10-year-old digital camera. The audio's not the best. The focus is not the best. The lighting is not the best. The host is definitely not the best. But I just want to see how well it works when I'm using equipment that I already own. So bear with me. Take those few things in there. Let me know if you like it. That's cool. This is as much for my little scrapbook for later as anything else. But if you enjoy, that's cool. Thanks, everybody. I'm standing in the parade grounds for Fort Richardson. Fort Richardson is sort of it was the outpost of the frontier force of Texas, and it's probably one of the best, not only restored but intact, of all the forts that are scattered out across the western frontier of Texas. Behind me is a reconstructed officers' barracks that's also the interpretive center. The fort was in use originally as a frontier fort for about 6 years, from 1876 to 1882. Oops, correction here. It was actually 11 years, from 1867 to 1878. The actual cleared areas with the buildings in them is about half of the overall fort. And I'm going to I'm going to let you kind of take a look. This is half of the fort. Yeah, as you probably guess, the wind generators, they weren't there in the fort. That's a slightly more. I'm walking over towards the hospital area. If you get a chance to get out here, take the tour. They have tours twice a day, every day, Monday through Friday. And they'll actually take you behind the scenes a little bit in the hospital, and it's pretty cool. They've got original medicines and surgery equipment, stretchers and beds set up. It's set up exactly pretty much like it was as a hospital in the 1970s. I'll turn around a little bit and let you take a look at the hospital itself. This was reconstructed, but it's not exactly the way it was when it was in use. The main reason was when they put this together in 1968. Hi folks, me again. All right, the noise just got to be too much, so I stopped for a second. What I was trying to say right there was that the front of that hospital is not the way it would have looked when the fort was in operation. The reason being is that when they reconstructed it, they were using plans from another fort in the area, and they just assumed that they were all built the same. It wasn't until many years later that they found an actual photograph was actually given to them by the descendants of one of the soldiers that had served there during World War II, and it showed it with a two-story front. So there were actually two porches. What you see the one in the picture, but there was another one up above it. Very similar to what a lot of the larger homes, the way they were built during the time. I'm now at a barracks. The barracks themselves were pretty stark, but also pretty crowded. At its height, there were over 700 soldiers here. And they lived in these barracks. Again, take the tour, they'll take you inside. They were sleeping at some point they were sleeping 3 to a bed. Of course, and it was not in shifts. So it was definitely close in. Different world back then. The men didn't like to take baths. There's a creek. We're on Lost Creek, and it actually goes all the way around the fort. Over behind the hospital here, there's it's real close in right there. But as you can see, that's about a 100-yard walk just to take a bath. Well, the men didn't like doing it, but you can imagine it got a little ripe in those barracks, to the point where Mackenzie, the commander of the fort, actually came out and made an edict that every man would take a bath once a month. I want to bring you in a little close here and show you something. Now, this is true on all of the wood structures like this, or the pole wood, I call it, structures. You can see these are basically log houses, not like you would see on some of the big log shows. They're not big, they're posts. They're cedar or mesquite or cottonwood posts, and they're chinked in between. Back in the day, this chinking here in the middle, now this is concrete and it's modern materials, but back in the day, they in the wintertime, the soldiers would fill these in with buffalo or cow dung and shredded paper and straw, just to keep the wind out, to keep the cold wind out in the wintertime. But in the summertime, in order to get better air circulation, they'd come in and they'd take this out, and they just leave the gap open so the breeze could go through. I'm at the magazine. And no, this isn't National Geographic or anything like that. A magazine is where you keep the stuff that blows up. Gunpowder, cannonballs, rifle ammunition, this type of thing. They always kept them. I'm quite a ways away from the rest of the fort, as you can see. They keep it away from it. They put it in a very heavily constructed building. I'm going to say probably the walls on this thing are about 4 feet thick, solid stone. The roof was designed to implode, actually fall down if anything blew up. And it had a 6-inch thick iron door on it. So obviously, if anything were to happen in there, it would be pretty well contained. Little interesting note about this, as I step inside. A couple of things to note about it. You can see these holes over here in the wall. Well, those were for logs to be placed, and they kind of went at an angle, and a mezzanine type level was put up across the top of it up here. And the gunpowder was kept up there. And then the cannonballs and those types of things, the things that it wouldn't hurt to get wet, they'd be on the floor. Another interesting thing to note about this is that if there was ever an Indian attack, and as far as I know, as far as I can tell, there never really was one here. But all the women and the children could come in here, and obviously they closed that big old 6-inch thick iron door. And I don't think bows and arrows and rifle ammunition are going to penetrate. But I don't know if you noticed while we were in there, there's one thing sadly missing, and that's ventilation. So, might be a little uncomfortable, but better than being shot, right? Another thing I wanted to show was graffiti. There's elsewhere in the park, but not so much as I've seen on this building. You can see where there's several areas where people have scratched their names into this. But from what I can tell, they're older. This is not recent stuff. Now, whether it's from the time of the fort itself or the time between World War II, which we'll discuss in a minute, and 1968, when the Parks and Wildlife Department took this over, I can't really tell. After the fort closed or was abandoned from its first duties in the late 1870s up to the turn of the century, a railroad was put in through here, and it was a branch off of a railroad that went from Weatherford down to Fort Worth. As you can imagine, that was pretty important to the people here. It gave them access to the outside world, made travel easier, all these types of things. But as is for a lot of cases with the smaller railroads, the advent of the automobile, it killed some of the smaller railroads, and this particular branch or spur was no different. Of course, when a railroad leaves town, they leave a lot of stuff behind. The rails, the ties, ballast, all that type of things. And usually the locals, they'll get those and they'll repurpose them, they'll use them for other things. But some things are they're just a little too big to reuse. We'll take, for instance, a railroad bridge, like the one behind me here. What do you do with a big old chunk of iron that weighs, if not several thousand, at least several hundred tons? Well, this bridge behind me used to be across the Lost Creek. Well, the land on either side where the bridge was, it was owned by two different people, two different families. And because it touched both of their lands, they both claimed it as their own. They argued about it for a long time. Neither one of them would give in. Well, one of the landowners, went on vacation, and the other one decided, well, that's the perfect time for him to take ownership of that bridge. So he got himself a couple of big bulldozers and a couple of big tractor trailers, hooked up to the bridge, and started to drag it over onto his land. Well, he got it about 500 yards up the road, made a turn, and the bulldozers both blew out their engines. Well, the tractor trailers, there was no way they were going to be able to pick it up. So, he just left it. Where you see it right now is where those bulldozers blew their engines. That's right, we're at the morgue. Obviously, the good doctors and nurses at the hospital, which by the way, we're right behind, well, they did everything they could, but you're not going to save every patient. I think, what was it, the line from MASH? In war, people die. That's rule number one. Rule number two is doctors can't do anything about rule number one. The morgue, believe it or not, was a late addition to the fort. It was built about 3 years before the fort closed. And before that, the morgue was up there in the on the second floor of the hospital. Well, there was a particular instance that, while it may not have driven them to build the morgue solely on its own, it obviously had to have something to do with it. When bodies were removed from the hospital, it sometimes took several days to get to the point where they were ready for burial. Well, remember what I said, this is Texas. At one particular point, they were carrying a body downstairs from that upstairs. And one of the soldiers that was carrying it tripped. And he fell down the stairs, and the body was catapulted past him, landed on the floor, and mothers, cover your kids' ears for this one. The way I heard it put was, it basically blew up like a pumpkin. Obviously not something you wanted to put in a hospital, so they built a place for the morgue. A couple of other things about this. If I could go inside, I'd show it to you, but there is a coffin up in there. So they would bring him down here, they'd put him in a fresh coat of clothes, they put him in the coffin, and then send him out for burial. Well, the coffins were actually just a little bit under 6 feet long, because people were short in those days. I think the men's average height was about 5'5", and the women's was slightly under 5 foot. Okay, Mom, cover up the kids' ears again. If you had somebody that wouldn't fit because they were too tall, they just cut their legs off and stuffed them in beside them. Hey, wood's not easy to come by out here. Okay, last little bit of interest, special interest, about Fort Richardson. The fort actually had 3 lives. The first, of course, was as a frontier outpost. The other 2 were somewhat more modern. They were 20th century. In the 30s and up into the 40s, this fort was a training center for the Army Reserve. In particularly, the 131st Field Artillery, 2nd Battalion. Yeah, I'm reading it off the plaque behind me here. That particular group, made up of a lot of folks from around in this area, was sent off to the Pacific, and they were actually on a boat in the Pacific when Pearl Harbor happened. They were assigned to Java with the intent of protecting that from the Japanese. Java fell. They were captured in 42. And they spent the rest of the war in Japanese POW camps. They did, primarily they were in forced construction for the Japanese in the Burma and Siam Railway. I was reading that off of this plaque. But there's an interesting note here, even beyond that. If you haven't seen the movie Bridge over the River Kwai, you should. The basic premise on that is soldiers were forced labor for the Japanese, and they were forced to build a railroad bridge across the River Kwai obviously it was part of that Burma-Siam Railway. And they conspired to not only slow construction down, do those type of things, but they actually blew it up. Well, believe it or not, that was based on a true story, and it was these guys that did it. Okay, hang on a minute. There's going to be some wonks out there that are going to slam me for this. I know. Stop for a second. The work that was done on the railway by the Lost Battalion and others was brutal. There was a reason why the British never built that railway. As a matter of fact, it was because of the cost in lives that it would do that they decided not to do it. The Japanese didn't care about that. They had slave labor. Many, many soldiers died trying to build that railroad. The movie really does not do much to add to that story. It's very fantastical, period. But here's the deal. It was a good movie, for starters. And the tie-in between this group of Texas soldiers and that undertaking and all of that, and the brutality of the Pacific War, anything that can get people to understand that, I'm going to promote. So troll me if you want. I think it was a good tie. Well, it looks like I'm even more long-winded on video than I am on print. This took a lot longer than I thought it would, but I had a lot of fun doing it. I hope you have a lot of fun watching it. Later, folks.